Welcome to Royal History UK, where the past comes alive.
Okay, so you want to understand the Second World War. You probably already know the famous battles, the iconic generals, and, the dramatic turning points. But what if I told you that the real story of the war isn't on the battlefield at all? Today, in this explainer, we're looking way past the front lines to uncover the hidden engine of global conflict. We are going to dig into the ledgers, the sprawling supply chains, and the factory floors running at 3 in the morning. We're talking about treasuries emptying out faster than any government actually wanted to admit.
Let me just hit you with a number that puts all of this into perspective. $4 trillion. Adjusted for today's money, the total cost of World War II absolutely blew past $4 trillion. And remember, that's not the cost for just one country or one theater of war. That's the combined cost of every single bullet, every ship, every bombed-out city, every ration tin, and every tank that was built and destroyed. It is literally the most expensive event in the entire history of human civilization. And get this, that staggering price tag only counts direct military spending. It doesn't even touch the burning factories, the rotting harvests, or the truly extreme lengths these countries went to just to stay solvent. Okay, let's dive right into this. Here is our agenda for today. We'll start with Section 1, funding total global conflict. Then 2, factories as the second front. 3, resources, logistics, and Lend-Lease. 4, starving the access economies. And finally, 5, building the post-war order.
All right, Section 1, funding total global conflict.
Now, you might be wondering, when the bills are arriving at a rate that makes peacetime budgets look like pocket change, how on earth does a country spend way more money than it actually has and still manage to win? To answer that, you really can't understand the economics of the 1940s without understanding the incredibly fragile baseline of the 1930s. The world entered the war from a position of chronic economic fragility. By 1932, worldwide unemployment had blown past 30 million people, and international trade had contracted by 30%. I mean, this was the exact soil from which authoritarian regimes grew. In places like Germany, Italy, Japan, and the Soviet Union, governments rose to power on a single, really powerful promise. They would put people back to work. And their plan to deliver those jobs super quickly? Rapid rearmament. Every major power arrived at 1939 already carrying the deep economic wounds of the previous decade. So, your country is at war. Where does the money come from? Well, the honest answer is a terrifyingly precarious tightrope of 3 levers: taxes, borrowing, and printing money. Every major power had to use all 3, and they basically had to pull them simultaneously. Taxes alone wouldn't even come close to touching the cost. Borrowing alone would have totally collapsed the financial system. And printing alone, that just leads straight to hyperinflation. Honestly, no one found a way to fund total war through a single mechanism.
Let's look at how these levers were actually pulled in practice. Over in the US, the government transformed the income tax from something that only really touched wealthy elites into a mass tax. This jumped their revenue from 5% to almost 20% of the entire economy. For borrowing, the Federal Reserve stepped in as the buyer of last resort, pegging short-term interest rates at a crazy low 0.375% just to keep borrowing costs manageable. Meanwhile, Germany took that printing lever to a whole new level of sophistication. Through a dummy company, they secretly issued 12 billion Reichsmarks in what were called Mefo bills. This essentially allowed the Nazi government to fund a massive military expansion that technically didn't even exist on the public ledger.
Moving on to Section 2, factories as the second front. Because at some point, financial tactics become entirely secondary to pure brute force production. You can have the absolute best trained soldiers in the world and still lose if the enemy is outproducing you 10-1. And this brilliantly illustrates the contrasting philosophies of the two sides. The Allies committed to absolute mass production. Just look at Ford's Willow Run plant. At the time, aviation experts thought Henry Ford was literally insane for trying to build complex aircraft on a moving assembly line. But by late 1943, that single plant was completing a fully assembled B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. Germany, on the other hand, favored hyper-complex over-engineering. I mean, at one point, their fragmented industry produced 151 different truck variants. They focused on engineering masterpieces like the Tiger tank, which were, sure, brilliant, but also mechanically unreliable, hugely expensive, and produced in incredibly low volumes. You really see the pure insanity of Allied manufacturing scale in ship construction. Standard merchant vessels used to take about 230 days to build. But then, industrialist Henry Kaiser brought in auto industry mass production methods, things like electric arc welding and prefabricated modular sections. He completely shattered the old timeline, getting the average down to under 50 days. And, as a pure flex of industrial might, his yards assembled the SS Robert E. Peary in exactly 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. Industrial capacity like this didn't just support the war, it basically decided the outcome before the decisive battles were even fought. But wait, because perhaps the most audacious industrial achievement of all belongs to the Soviet Union. When the German invasion threatened their Western industrial heartland, the Soviets didn't just move their output, they moved the factories themselves. Over 1,500 defense factories were literally loaded onto trains and shipped thousands of kilometers east to the Urals and Siberia. In places like Tankograd, machines were up and running in minus 30 degrees Celsius temperatures before the factory roofs were even finished. By relentlessly simplifying their designs, they cut the man-hours needed to assemble a T-34 tank from 8,000 down to 3,700, allowing them to churn out an unbelievable 84,000 of them.
Okay, Section 3, Resources, Logistics, and Lend-Lease.
Of course, building thousands of weapons is really only half the battle. Think about it. A tank without fuel or a functioning supply chain isn't a weapon, it's just a very expensive steel obstacle. Early in the war, the utter desperation to secure these resources led to some extreme economic measures. By late 1940, Britain was technically surviving, but its treasury was effectively empty. They had to pay for American weapons in cash, and the dollars were just gone. Enter Operation Fish. In extraordinary, unbelievable secrecy, Britain physically relocated approximately $2.5 billion in gold reserves and securities across the submarine-infested Atlantic over to Canada. Britain was literally packing up and selling off its national wealth just to stay in the war another few months.
Now, that was obviously unsustainable, which is exactly why the United States introduced the Lend-Lease Act, sending over $50 billion in materials to its allies. The U.S. had a massive, almost unfair advantage: geographic immunity. Sitting thousands of miles away from the front lines, its factories and shipyards were never bombed. It could run at absolutely full capacity, acting as the ultimate arsenal of democracy. An incredible $31.4 billion went to Britain, and $11.3 billion went to the Soviet Union.
Absolutely critical. You see, it wasn't just guns. America sent 400,000 trucks, mostly Studebakers, and those provided the hidden logistical mobility for massive Soviet offensives. They sent 4.5 million tons of food, things like canned meat and powdered eggs, literally keeping the Red Army fed. But here is the biggest takeaway. Because the Americans were providing the trucks and the food, Soviet factories were freed up to focus almost entirely on building those 84,000 T-34 tanks we talked about earlier. Without that American logistical backbone, the massive Soviet pushes of 1943 and 1944 simply wouldn't have been possible.
All right, let's flip the script. Section 4, Starving the Axis Economics.
So, while the Allies were building this completely unstoppable economic juggernaut, what was happening on the other side? Well, we need to look at how Axis military decisions were often just desperate economic necessities in disguise. Take Japan, for example. Their fundamental problem was purely geological. Their home islands simply lacked the raw materials needed for a modern industrial war. In July 1941, the U.S. imposed a strict embargo that completely cut off 90% of Japan's imported oil, leaving them with less than 2 years of reserves. Japan faced this devastating illusion of choice. The attack on Pearl Harbor? It was not primarily a grand military strategy. It was a cold, strict economic calculation to seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies before their economy strangled to death. But it was a totally flawed plan anyway, because American submarines ultimately sank 55% of Japan's merchant fleet, meaning all that conquered oil could barely even reach the factories back home.
Over in Europe, Germany faced a very similar strangulation. Allied bombing campaigns methodically targeted the chemical plants that converted coal into liquid fuel. Just look at the absolute collapse in Germany's synthetic oil production. In April 1944, they produced 316,000 tons. By September, down to just 17,000 tons. That is a 95% collapse. The Luftwaffe couldn't fly, the mighty panzer divisions couldn't even maneuver. So, the crucial point here is that the Allies systematically dismantled the infrastructure the German army depended on, severing that invisible chain from raw material to deployed soldier. Which finally brings us to Section 5, Building the Post-War Order. We often think of the formal surrenders in 1945 as the moment the armies were officially defeated, but in reality, those surrenders simply acknowledged an economic defeat that had already happened. The systems that armed, fed, and moved those soldiers were already totally destroyed. And when the dust finally settled, the sheer imbalance of global wealth was staggering. The United States emerged with its industrial base completely untouched, its population fed, and holding an astonishing 70% of the world's gold reserves in 1945.
Now, what's really interesting about this is that because the rest of the major powers were economically devastated, the United States found itself in this highly unique position to entirely dictate the rules of the New World and basically determine the shape of the global economy for the next half-century. They used that immense leverage to essentially engineer the modern global financial system right from scratch. The Bretton Woods Agreement pegged the US dollar directly to gold and created institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. Then the Marshall Plan pumped billions of dollars into rebuilding Europe, and a big reason for that was because a shattered Europe simply couldn't buy American goods. And perhaps most significantly, they comprehensively restructured the economies of Germany and Japan. The US made the incredibly sophisticated economic calculation that rebuilding their defeated enemies into strong, market-oriented partners was far cheaper and much safer than just leaving them as failed states that would inevitably incubate another war.
Which leaves us with a final, lingering thought to take away from today's explainer. We've seen that the defining conflict of the 20th century wasn't just won by generals moving pieces on a map. It was won by factory workers, financial planners, and brilliant logisticians. The side that mastered the economics is the side that mastered the war. So if the fate of the entire world was ultimately decided by assembly lines, supply chains, and raw materials back then, what invisible economic engines are silently determining the global conflicts of today? Thanks for joining me, and I'll leave you to think on that.